result is tens of thousands, not tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, no longer hundreds of thousands, but over 1 million Iraqis have died as a result of this. If the United States were to withdraw from Iraq, all that death would withdraw with them. Nobody in Iraq has the kind of firepower that allows them to do this kind of killing. No one at all, right? It's only the US that has that kind of firepower. And that's the next thing I want to talk. I want to give you one more example of American firepower to give you a sense of what it looks like when the US really pulls out all the stops. This has to do with a place in Iraq called Haifa Street. It's a neighborhood that's named after the street, Haifa Street. It happens to border directly on the Green Zone, and it's been on and off a center for the Sunni insurgency since the start of the war. One of the places where the Sunni insurgents have been most comfortable and well ensconced. And by the way, this has been a peaceful area most of the time because the Sunni insurgents controlled it most of the time. The violence that has taken place in Haifa Street has been when the United States has attempted to capture it, and then the violence has been very severe. In the latest report, this was the first battle of the surge, okay? It actually started the day that Bush gave his speech on January 10th. That day, earlier that day, this battle began, right? And this is what it was like when the US went into Haifa Street. In the pre-dawn darkness, the joint forces, US military, American military units in the lead, Iraqi military units under the command of the US military following them. In the pre-dawn darkness, the joint forces took control of the buildings surrounding Talil Square, a key target of the operation. This is Major Jesse Pearson who led the charge. He says, "We showed up in their living room for breakfast. About 7 a.m., the trouble began. As soon as the sun came up, the insurgents began shooting." Now, in Haifa Street, they had cordoned off the area so that none of the insurgents could sneak away and hide, right? They were stuck there, right? So they were forced to fight. "We started taking it from all sides," Schaefer recalled. That's the sergeant who's serving under Major Pearson. "From rooftops and doorways, the gunmen fired AK-47 assault rifles and machine guns. Snipers were also targeting the US and Iraqi soldiers. US soldiers started firing back with 50 caliber machine guns. That's just the beginning of it, mounted on their Stryker armored vehicles. They used TOW missiles and Mark 19 grenade launchers. The F-15 fighter jets strafed rooftops with cannons while the Apaches fired Hellfire missiles." So you get this picture, right? As soon as they fall under this kind of return attack, right after they enter the community, the air power is brought out. First, they're using the cannons from the air power, and then they're using Hellfire missiles, air-to-surface missiles. Right? 11 hours of battle followed, and of course the Americans prevailed. And then they went into house-to-house searches, arresting and killing suspected insurgents. Right? This is what it looks like when all hell breaks loose. So you have this daily grind, and then you have these occasional huge battles like this. Right? The outcome of this battle in Haifa Street was that many of the buildings were destroyed, and the community was vacated in many ways. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more later. Right? Now, what does it look like when the United States isn't there and this sectarian war is going on? Right? This is the thing that we hear all the time about, but we don't really hear about what this civil war actually looks like. We know there are suicide bombers and we know that there are death squads. That's what we know, right? The death squads go in, they grab people, they shoot, they torture them, usually with drills. They drill into their head with drills, right, and then they kill them, right? The suicide bombers, what we hear about, and which is the predominant thing, right, is that they drive a car next to a highly populated area in a Sunni community. A mosque or a market is the usual target, right? Explode these huge, powerful bombs and kill huge numbers of people who are sitting there, sometimes as many as 200 at a time, right? If you break it down between those two things, it doesn't sound like a civil war, right? And I think that's a misnomer, because civil war, at least, the common definition is armies facing each other and fighting, right? This is not armies facing each other and fighting. It's brutal, it's horrible, it's huge, death and destruction, right? But it's not what we picture, right? So I think we have to talk about these two things separately as two kinds of events. Where do the suicide bombs come from? First of all, let's be clear, there were no suicide bombers before the US went into Iraq, right? This is new with the invasion, right? Secondly, there weren't even very many of them for the first year or so. Occasional suicide bombs, and by the way, not in Shia areas, directed at people who were either members of the police or at the United States, right? The first suicide bombs were directed at the United States or Iraqi military and police, right? They started being directed at the Shia after the United States started using Shia troops and police in Sunni areas. It's a very important fact about the way this war operates, right? So that's point number two. Point number three, and this will blow you away. The United States is now running interference for suicide bombers. At the same time that they say their whole goal here is to stop the suicide bombers, they are actually facilitating the suicide bombers. And that facilitation has become much more profound and pronounced during the surge. Let me explain to you how this goes, okay? Here's a name that you've all heard, Fallujah, right? I hope that when all this is over and the world is a better place, that Fallujah, the name Fallujah, will have the same ring in people's mind as the name Guernica. Guernica is the first aerial bombing of the modern war period. It was done in the Spanish Civil War, and probably wouldn't have been remembered as vividly as we would want it to be, except for the fact that Picasso, maybe Picasso's greatest masterpiece, was painted around Guernica. And so it's now associated with the May